Hey guys, this is Dr. McFarland, and in this video we're going to be looking at a modular Helix setup. So what I have here in front of me is a HX, a Mission Engineering L6 expression pedal, and the HX Stomp. And the things you can do with this little setup is pretty powerful. And you may be wondering why you would even go this route, considering the cost of all these elements and power supplies and cables. But it can be a really fun setup once you get to know the ins and outs. So let me show you a few options here. Now, first off, we have the HX, which is only effects models from the Line 6 Helix and does not have any of the amp models nor cabs. It can load IRs or impulse responses, but there are 0 amps in the HX. The HX Stomp, on the other hand, has all the effects and amps and cabs, just like the full-size Helix, but it is about half the DSP of what a full-size Helix is. And as of right now, there's only 8 blocks available on the HX Stomp, and there's 9 blocks available on the HX. So essentially, by adding on an HX, you get double the processing power, just like you would a full-size Helix. And I am able to run 2 separate amps on the HX Stomp. And right now, my dock main rig, I have an effects loop, so I can add in things on the side down here. And I have the US Princess, which is a Princeton reverb amp, optical tremolo, octaverb, crisscross delay, which that can be any delay you want, and then a dynamic plate and a hall reverb. So it's pretty simple, and I could make this to where I have some snapshots called up on the 3 switches and just switch between my different snapshots, or I can have 3 different presets, or I can just have 3 different stomps as I have on right now. So if I hit this middle switch, it's going to turn on 3 different effects at once. And that's essentially my swell patch. If I turn that one off, it just goes back to a basic reverb amp, and that's about it. And then this one button here is for my tremolo. And then the other button over here is to bring in and out stuff from the effects loop. So if you want to treat this like a real amp, where you have an effects loop of the amp and you want to put some effects before and some effects after. So what I would do is essentially take the send of my HX, and this can be in either loop 1 or loop 2. And I would take that over to the input of the HX Stomp. Then I would take a second cable, go from the output of the Stomp, and put it into the return of the HX. So now instead of just having an octo, vintage swell, tube drive, elephant man delay, T-Maw, and a dynamic hall on the HX, I can go into my signal flow and I can add in an effects block right here. So right now it's set on effects loop 2, but I can easily change that to effects loop 1 just by hitting the big knob, going up to effects loop 1, and hitting save. So now the effects loop 1 is inserting the HX Stomp into the signal path. And we can easily move this around, like if I wanted it over here, or pretty much wherever I want. So this block is a 10-band graphic EQ. Then we have the vintage swell right there. So it'd probably be best to move the HX Stomp right here. So that way I have my T-Maw, tube drive, some vibrato going before the amp. Then after the Stomp, I would have my 10-band graphic EQ, vintage swell, elephant man, dynamic hall, and octo. So it would get a little crazy having all those delays and reverbs on the HX, and also having that same little setup on the HX Stomp. It would be very wet, very swimmy, but that is an option. Okay, another option you can do is you could take a guitar cable and go into the input of the HX. Then we can unplug the output and then take this cable and send this to the output of the HX. So guitar to input, output of HX to the input of the HX Stomp. And now we can set up a totally separate preset on the HX that only has drives and preamp effects. And what I mean by preamp is just effects you put before the input of the amp. And for me, that's any kind of drive, wah-wah, filter effect, phase, flange, stuff like that. So that would allow me to offload any effects off the HX Stomp that's not before the amp. And then I can still keep this button right here to bring in and out different delays, maybe bring in a tremolo, and so on. Another option we can have here is to do the 4 cable method, But we really don't have to do that with this setup unless you just really want to. But what the 4-cable method is doing for you is you're using the HX effects into the loop of the HX Stomp. So therefore you can get your drive effects going to the front end of your amp, but then having all the wet effects going after your amp. But as you've already seen in my 2 other examples, you can pretty much place the HX Stomp inside of the loop of the HX effects and essentially get the same exact setup. You're just using the loop on the effects instead of using the loop on the side of the stomp. So if you want to go crazy and have multiple cables, then that's perfectly fine. I'm just saying you don't have to go that route if you don't want to. Now the tones you've been hearing so far in this video have been going into the power amp in on my Supro Delta King 12. And I'm doing that because I'm using the amp on the Stomp acting as my preamp, and then the Supro is acting as my power amp. So if you want to use this setup with a real amp, then that's the way I would suggest to go. But if you're in a situation where you need a silent stage, I would just take your output of the HX Stomp and then send it to a direct box, since you don't have an XLR option on the HX Stomp, and then that signal would be sent to front of house. You just have to make sure you understand the signal flow, and if you want to use some effects from the HX effects to go before the amp, then you wouldn't really want to do that because the Stomp would be after those effects. But you could put the HX effects into the effects loop over here, and then turn that on and off with the switch. And that's how I was using a different setup with the Boss MS3. I would essentially have pedals in the loops of the MS3, and then all that would be going into the loop of the HX Stomp, and I can just bring in and out those effects whenever I wanted. So you could have a wall pedal in block 1 over here, then all your other stuff from the HX effects in effects loop, and then you have your amp, then you have your wet effects, and your tremolo. Or if you just want your HX effects to be all your pre-effects, then have the Stomp be everything else, like your amp and your wet effects, then you can just hook up the Mission Engineering to the expression on your HX effects, and you're good to go. A great advantage to having the HX effects is you can change channels on an amp, either via a TS cable or a TRS cable, depending on what your amp is and what style of switch it needs. And technically, if you want your cables to be nice and short, you could have your HX Stomp be on the right and your HX effects be on the left. So that way the effect sends and returns on the right side of the unit would be a lot closer to the inputs and outputs of the HX Stomp. And then you can still keep your Mission Engineering expression in the middle for easy access. So let me know, guys, what you think about this setup, and would you consider this for your next rig? If you want to learn more about guitars and modelers, then be sure to subscribe to my channel and click the bell so you'll be notified the next time I release a new video. And in the meantime, I'm Dr. McFarland, and I will see you in the next one. Keep rocking.